Welcome to the global seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean of Global Engagement, and I'm so honored that you've joined us today for the second seminar in a global series focused on reimagining African cities, design, participation, and diplomacy. A series that invites experts to step into the collaboratory to discuss how African cities have been transformed and ways deliberate efforts in Africa's largest cities can address pressing global needs, such as rural-to-urban migration, the immense pressure on available resources, urban planning, sustainability, and resilience. Now, before we begin this important discussion, and especially for those of you joining us for the very first time today, I want to provide a bit of background about the Global Columbia Collaboratory. Columbia's University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the collaboratory in May of 2020 as a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together. It promotes cross-cultural communication and enhances skills and global competencies, allowing students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make a difference in the world. Students have participated from over 45 countries around the world and are drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, as well as visiting institutions. This fall, we have 44 students from 13 countries, representing 16 universities. They're tuning in this morning from across Africa, Asia, Europe, including New York, Nairobi, Banjul, Tambacounda, Mumbai, Dublin, Taipei, and Munich, just to name a few. Our students have submitted questions for our panelists, and I encourage our global audience to submit questions as well. I also want to thank all of our partners and our esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Center in Nairobi, the City Diplomacy Lab, and our partnering NGOs, Grow Biointensive Agricultural Center of Kenya, Kenya Biogas, and Napolitans. Without further ado, then, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Murugi Ndorangu, Director of Columbia Global Center Nairobi, who will serve as our moderator for today. Murugi?
Thank you very much, Shannon. The students participating in the Global Columbia Collaboratory, friends and colleagues of Columbia Global Centers, Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, and participants from around the globe. I welcome you to our global seminar on reimagining African cities, design, participation, and diplomacy. This is the second of 3 seminars in our Healthy Series, in our Healthy Cities series. My name is Murugi Ndorangu, as Shannon has said, and I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers Nairobi. CGC Nairobi, as it is popularly known, is part of a network of 11 centers worldwide, founded by Columbia University. The centers serve as knowledge hubs that aim to educate and inspire through research, dialogue, and action. Since the 1990s, African cities have doubled from about 3,300 to just below 8,000. As both the youngest and the most rapidly growing cities in the world, there's a big shift of population from the rural to the urban areas, resulting in straining of resources. Most of Africa was colonized, and the original infrastructure has received minimal, if any, upgrades over the years. Increased populations has also resulted in more informal settlements, congestion, a rise in poverty levels, and inequality in the distribution of resources across the board. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest proportion of informal settlement dwellers characterized by lack of basic infrastructure due to poor urban development. With the increased economic growth, better urbanization 2030, and the African Union 2063 agendas. Our panelists will discuss various factors that must be implemented for an efficient sustainable, resilient, and inclusive urban African city. Let me now introduce our panelists. It's Professor Noah Chazen. Noah is an adjunct associate professor of architecture in the urban design program at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. In addition to his role in the Masters of Science in Architecture and Urban Design faculty, he's an affiliate faculty at Columbia's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. He received his PhD in architectural and urban history from the City University of New York Graduate Center, and is a historian, critic, theorist, specifically emphasizing the relationship between urban design, planning, and human rights. His teaching, research, and writing center on human rights issues in urban conflict zone, especially when exacerbated by the climatic emergency, questioning how citizenship and access are adjudicated in urban social network. Our second panelist is Dr. Lorenzo Grandi. Lorenzo is a founding director of the City Diplomacy Lab at Columbia Global Center, Paris. He's a lecturer in city diplomacy at Columbia Undergraduate Global Engagement, Science Po, they call Polytechnic. Lorenzo regularly advises international organizations, national government, city networks, and municipality on how to fully unfold city diplomacy's added value. He's the author of City Diplomacy, published by Macmillan, and he holds a dual PhD in political theory from EHESS and in Paris and LUISS in Rome. Our third panelist is Professor Emanuela Jogi from the School of Architecture, Art and Design at Technological de Monterrey, a professor at EAAD. He develops and teaches, does research on the issues of communities and sustainable territory development. He has a PhD in civil engineering and architecture of Pavia in Italy. In 2020, he published the book, The Co-Housing Environmental Alliance in Times of Change, which has already been purchased by more than 200 libraries from various prestigious universities. Let me now invite Noah Chazen to present on strategies against inequality, African rights to the city 2023. Welcome, Noah.
Thank you. And I will share my screen. Is that working for everybody?
Yes, yes,
okay,
it is.
Great. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Durangu, and to Pauline and to the Columbia Global Center in Nairobi. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and in particular to make a connection that I think has not been as strong as anybody would have liked, which is between the Columbia School of Architecture and the Global Center in Nairobi. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to not only talk about the sorts of questions and issues that are most important to me in terms of my research and what I also believe are the key determining factors in terms of accessing a right to the city in 2023, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, but we're talking specifically about Africa, and then to use that as an opportunity to highlight some projects from an urban design perspective, one from our program and another local in Kenya, in Nairobi, that I think will end hopefully on a slightly more optimistic note than I probably will start with. So, and I should also say I'm not an expert in African urbanism per se, but insofar as there are some structural similarities among cities around the globe, I think that there's something worthwhile in trying to understand how those mitigating factors are understood both on a structural level as well as in a specific level. So I'll start with a somewhat more expansive scope. And Dr. Durango already pointed out that Africa is, of all the continents in the world, the most rapidly urbanizing anywhere. And just looking at some infographics that I think might help to illuminate just how quickly this is happening. This is using an interactive map from africopolis.org. Some of you may be familiar with it, but just to go through very quickly, if we look at what the urbanization and the urban population was on the African continent in 1950, you have about 28 million people, about 13% of the population. As you move into 2000, you can already see this radical shift, right? So we're going from 27,000, we're going almost tenfold, right, into an urban population of about 27 million. The level of urbanization is still more or less the same, but the metropolitan population growing, and the number of cities drastically increasing. And then if we go to 2020, the latest date with which there is any kind of data, we see now we have gone from 27 million to 684 million, right? So we've now made this exponential jump, and you see the proliferation of urban centers, and you can look at the key down below and see the different colors that indicate the different sizes of the cities. All of this is probably not news to most of you who are looking at this, but just looking at those numbers, from 27 million to 290 million to 684 million, and this is an upward trajectory that everybody expects will be only exacerbated and increased and compounded as time moves forward. So this is not something that is leveling off in any way. In other places in the world, urbanization has actually hit a sort of leveling off point, but on the African continent, absolutely not. And it is probably a truism that when you have that kind of urbanization, there is going to be, again, these are some themes that Dr. Durango already pointed out, but that there is a tremendous amount of movement, and that movement is due to all sorts of factors, whether it is internal conflict, whether it is opportunity, and whether it is something that I think is an underlying issue, and one that's very much at the center of my inquiries, which is I will refer to as the climate emergency, so as to not be ambiguous in any way about what is happening, and specifically how that's driving the forces of movement of urbanization, and then also compounding problems of urbanization as the climate emergency becomes more acute and more terrifying. So you have, on the one hand, as a result of the changing climate, a movement towards urbanization simply because of the lack of resources that are available in formerly agrarian areas, and the opportunities that potentially are available in urban spaces. But of course, urban spaces themselves are already stressed by climatological conditions themselves, not to mention aging and inadequate infrastructure, overcrowding, and a lack of buy-in from both local and international actors. And one of the things that I wanted to balance here was the tension, if you will, between local, which is to say city, state, and federal governments, and external funders, of which there are tremendous number in Africa as well as elsewhere, primarily at this point from China. And what happens when there are non-local actors who are making a financial investment in the refurbishment, the restructuring, the re-envisioning of cities, how that may, on one hand, accelerate the process of urbanization and bring projects to fruition in a more rapid way, but at the same time, also minimizing the local effort, which then fails to take into account what are very important voices that need to be brought to the table, which are local communities, both indigenous as well as recent immigrants, and of course the movement of migration in Africa is one that is both internal as well as external. So in migration as well as out migration, primarily from the north of Africa into Europe, into Southern Europe. But as we can see, when you look at the charts, that you see that there's actually within Africa, I mean, we look at the just 2020 to begin with, you see that the migrants from Africa, meaning leaving Africa, are about 45% of the 42 million that are predicted to have moved during that year. 48 of them were moving internally, right? So, and where they were primarily moving was from agricultural and or nomadic places into urban spaces. So as a result of that, the urban spaces are being stressed, and that is exacerbated by, if not largely instigated by, the number of natural disasters. And just looking at the natural disasters in sub-Saharan Africa, leaving aside very important events that have happened in the past few months, including the flooding in Libya and the earthquake in Morocco, both of which have been to this point sort of attributed to geophysiological issues, but ultimately I'm certain will be attributed to the climate emergency as well. The number of people affected, of course, as the populations of all of the countries in Africa grow, the number of people are going to be affected. And as they urbanize those urban spaces, which are not only primarily located, although not exclusively, around the coastline, therefore extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, that's going to imperil an additional number of people as well. And that will, if those cities haven't made up the kind of advancements that are necessary in order to accommodate these larger populations, you're going to see a significant loss in terms of GDP among all of the different countries. And these are just predictions based on, the highly unlikely no warming, the Paris Agreement, if everybody were to, in fact, adhere to the elective process of the Paris Agreement and have a 1.5 degree temperature rise, you still see a dramatic decrease in the GDP, and 3%, 3 degrees Celsius, which is that terrifying, hopefully never to be seen number, is the one that will really devastate us. But at that point, there will be so many other problems beyond GDP that maybe that will become, somewhere elsewhere on the scale. And I want to focus specifically, just for the remainder of my time, on the issue of water, which underscores and underlies a lot of the questions around vulnerability that arises out of the climate crisis, and looking at a map of the continent and looking at the overall water risk. And that's water risk both in terms of droughts as well as floods. And those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can sometimes happen in the same regions, this waxing and waning of highly volatile climatological conditions. So you see that the vast majority of the continent is in some extremely high category of overall water risk. And in terms of, this is a project that was done by University of Notre Dame here in the United States, which is they call the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, which looks at the vulnerability of countries. It goes through 185 countries, looking at the vulnerability, the exposure, the sensitivity, ability to cope with climate change, and other global challenges, including ecosystem services, food, health, human habitat, infrastructure, adaptive capacity, and looking at how all of these agglomerated categories of vulnerability and readiness play out. And unfortunately, if we look at the very bottom of the list, you'll see that among the bottom 20 or so, I forget exactly how many it is, but I think it's 17 out of the 20 are in Africa. So the readiness measured against the vulnerability is already very much stacked against African nations. And so what happens as a result of that? And we have to realize also, and this is something that is, I could go way off into a tangent, but that when we talk about cities and urbanization, those cities are not necessarily exclusively bounded by the municipal district itself. That every city is in many ways, whether it's through satellite technology, whether it's through submarine cables, whether it's through imports and exports, is that every single city around the world is now tied to many different rural, suburban, peri-urban areas. And I'm just showing you a project from the Amazon. I mean, this is definitely, we're moving away from Africa for a moment, but just this is a project that I think illustrates this point really well, which is that when you look at the Amazon, it is in fact, or at least this project proposes that it is in fact already an urbanized area, even though it is a natural resource. The natural resources that are extracted from it and brought to urban areas around the country, around the world, effectively engage the Amazon into an urban network, a global urban network that has been referred to, among other things, as planetary urbanism. And there are many positive things that can come out of urbanization. It can drive economic transformation in terms, relative to a rural population, that workers in skilled occupations have greater opportunities for gaining wealth. It increases education. These are just some graphs that might be useful. Improves access to financial services and increases the GDP per capita. And these are all wonderful things and wonderful improvements, but there's something quite abstract about it. And the question is, to what extent do we see the kinds of projects, the sorts of investments in urban centers, in urban areas, and we're speaking specifically of Africa, where the benefit of the greatest number of people is taken into account. This is a project that was done by Columbia University, by the Urban Design Program in 2020. It's part of a water urbanism project that we had done. I was not involved directly with this. I had the students in the prior semester sort of preparing them intellectually for this project. But this is a water design studio for Addis Ababa, done in conjunction with some university and some other actors there, specifically looking at the way in which the right to the city is compromised by the kinds of investments made in the rejuvenation of the city that aren't necessarily dealing with the crises that exist on the ground, and instead are there to benefit the greatest, the top 1%, or those who have the the sort of specialized status. And this was in response particular to a project that was started in 2019 called the Beautifying Sheger Project, which was a way of transforming a place that was highly vulnerable in terms of water into a much more diverse, ecologically friendly site. But what ended up happening was that many people were displaced as a result of that. They weren't given opportunities to move elsewhere. They didn't have the means to do so. And that the demolishing of areas here that was intended to be of benefit to the city as a whole had a beautifying effect, yes, but was also extremely exclusive in terms of who was really gaining the benefit from it. And what our students did was to try to think about the ways in which community investment could be incorporated into beautification projects that are also sustainable economically as well as environmentally and socially, and to figure out the best way to do that with a community buy-in that isn't necessarily the way in which the city would go about it themselves. I think I'm going to, just because of time, I'll just do this project and stop there. But first, the students developed 10 principles in terms of community stewardship, embracing living landscapes, creating housing that enhances socioeconomic opportunities, and specifically looking at the most highly vulnerable, even within already vulnerable populations, women, migrants, and the poor. Redefining the notion of a world-class city, which the city and the government of Addis Ababa already had this notion, but it was one that was heavily influenced by the investments that were coming from abroad, primarily from China, and creating a design vocabulary that really was extracted from the site conditions in Addis Ababa as a means of building upon the social capital of the citizens of this city, and looked at these different nodes along the river, the same site that the Beautifying Sheger project was supposed to do, but instead of thinking about it as an exclusive, externally funded project, something that could be much more autochthonous and drawn from the population itself. So here is just one project that I'm showing you that was done by a group of 4 students, in which an alternative to the ecological degradation that was coming and that would, in their estimation, be exacerbated and possibly even amplified by the Beautifying Sheger project, to create instead social spaces that were sensitive and responding to needs that were coming out of local stakeholders. And this was undertaken by a series of interviews and discussions, workshops that were held in the area as a means of trying to build community buy-in, and also to understand how urban design could, in some sense, bring all of the positive benefits that the Beautifying Sheger project was going to bring, but with the current population, and especially the most vulnerable parts of that population, brought to the absolute forefront. And I know that I've run a little bit over time, so I'm going to stop there. But what I wanted to end with is this note of optimism that with projects that are really extracted from meaningful dialogues and conversations with local stakeholders and shareholders, we can find the opportunities to achieve the same results. It may not happen as quickly because the investment isn't the same, and it will not happen as rapidly, but it will happen in a way that benefits the greatest number of people, and that will also have lasting effects that perhaps will prove to be more effective than top-down approaches. And with that, I will thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Noah. Very engaging presentation. I wish we had more time to go into that discussion. Thank you. I encourage our participants to please drop your questions as the presentations go on in the Q&A box, and our panelists will be able to address them after the other 2 presenters talk. So for now, let me invite Lorenzo Grandi to make his presentation. Welcome, Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Murugi. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel where I'm already learning a lot. And so I will be delighted to share with you some reflection based on my professional and research activity with African cities. I'm going to share my screen for a few slides to give you some visuals of this really expanding trend called city diplomacy. We will focus into the capacity of African cities to connect to each other internationally and create a voice, which is the local voice of Africa, as we will see in a second. Just a quick word about the City Diplomacy Lab to introduce myself. The lab is based at Columbia Global Center Paris, of which it is a special project, but it has the privilege of working in partnership with the network of Columbia Global Centers, and of course with Columbia Global Center Nairobi, which is one of our favorite partners, I would say. And we also work with the other center of Columbia in Africa, which is in Tunisia, in Tunis. And I say hello to our colleagues from both centers. We work with the goal of supporting the spread and the understanding of this new phenomenon that I mentioned of city diplomacy. And I think it's very appropriate to look at this phenomenon from the lenses of African cities. And so to dig in immediately into this topic, these slides show you just a fraction of the multi-level collaboration between African cities happening right now. And you have all sorts of collaboration. Some of them, like you can see here, UCLG Africa, that's the most representative in terms of numbers, city network. They are defined as multi-purpose networks because they cover everything a city and a local government does, from urbanism to migration to food security, security itself. So there are a lot of topics that are dealt with. Then you have a number of thematic regional networks, such as, for example, the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa or ICLEI Africa, or even this one, REFELA. REFELA is a network of elected local councillors of Africa, female elected local councillors of Africa. So, well, this networks, they have a very specific action. Well, Covenant of Mayors equally, they focus on climate change, for example. And then, or even the Cities Alliance, which is very famous for working on informal settlements, on the townships or slums, as you can see here in the logo. And then you have also a number of language and cultural related city networks, such as this one this logo represents the union. It's a union of Arab Maghreb that has its own city network. Here it's the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. This one is the International Association of Francophone Mayors, and this one is the Association of Mayors of Capital Cities of Portuguese language. And to complete it, you have a number of external actors working in partnerships with African cities, such as the Swedish Association, the Swedish International Center for Local Democracy, VNG from the Netherlands. You have Cité Unifrance from France, ANCI from Italy, Connective Cities from Germany, Platforma from whole Europe. And each time they act in Africa, of course, they do it with a plurality of African cities and local governments. So there is a lot happening, even though it might not be one of the most famous urban dynamics happening. It's really impactful, as we will see. But maybe we should start with a step back to better understand what city diplomacy is. So city diplomacy, in a nutshell, it's the international action of cities and local governments. This covers a lot, of course. It is something that parallels the diplomacy of nation states because it is used to advance the priorities and address the challenges through a number of partnerships. These partnerships are, in fact, especially frequent between cities themselves with a regional as well as global dimension. But it also includes partnership with other actors, and the African cities, they interact, for example, with the African Union, with the European Union, multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank or the World Bank, and as well as with national development agencies, such as, for example, USAID from the United States, GIZ from Germany, AIX from Italy, and so on. There are a lot of them that offer opportunities to cooperate to those cities that are able, of course, to interact with them. We will see there is an issue of positioning and human resources, which is vital to fully access this dimension. So just very briefly to see how city diplomacy works, it really is similar to the ambassadorial duties of a traditional diplomat. It's representation and promotion with foreign partners and abroad. But it's also based and find its strength in the recognition of cities of sharing a number of challenges. These challenges are in fact adapted and they have features that differ from place to place. But I was really interested in the presentation of Professor Chazen. As you can see, this challenge of climate change is something happening at the continental level and reproducing itself in other continents as well. So there is a base of challenges. Those challenges that we say are global in nature, but urban in impact, majoritarily urban in impact, as we will discuss in a second. So once you identify that, you are able, of course, to take actions to have an impact, and joining forces has proved to be effective in this, in part because there are solutions that can be transferred with the peer learning and the knowledge exchange, but also because cities coming together, they can innovate together. And there are a lot of innovations that have proved to be the output of this dialogue and collaboration. We will see a few examples later. Finally, last but not least, it's the creation of this voice of cities that has mainly two targets: national governments and the international community, including international organizations. So it's about creating this local voice of Africa, which is a priority for cities involved in city diplomacy in Africa. When we analyze the topic of city diplomacy, we can see that it's very, very broad. We have seen some example of thematic actions, but those thematic actions, they encompass, I would say, all the dimensions of local governance, and it includes topics such as the promotion of culture and creativity, culture being also both tangible and intangible culture, so traditions, monuments, and so on. You have equity and inclusion with a strong focus in Africa, focusing on gender and on young people, on youth. Research and technology, the smart city, it's so important, and African cities have been at the forefront, have been innovators, and their positioning of innovation has been secured by this international connection that they are able to establish. Growth and activity, as well as employment, are definitely a big component of what the city wants from international relations. Climate change and climate action, no need for introducing this another time. Peace and reconciliation, peace in a broad sense, not only in countries that are experiencing a traditional peace with an invading or one or more, in fact, forces from outside fighting in the urban areas, but also episodes of systematized urban violence that happens actually in cities everywhere in the world, unfortunately. And finally, international solidarity with both the humanitarian and the technical component of it to address different kind of crises. No need to spend much time to say to describe the tools, I would just say that they really parallels the national tools of acting internationally. It goes from bilateral partnerships. Possibly the most famous one is the sister city agreement, if we use a term made famous by US cities, or the twinning agreement, which is most used in other continents. It's exactly the same way as an engagement of collaboration between two cities in different countries. And then multilateral tools, which includes the city networks. It's a systematized way of collaboration, but you have also other dimensions, such as advocacy campaigns, projects, and events. There is, of course, this is very exciting, as you can guess, that it requires a number of preconditions, and cities worldwide, they have to go through it. There is something that they do not control, which is a political and fiscal decentralization, the capacity to act internationally, as well as the means, of course, to go on the international stage. I have to say that all over Africa, there is a very important process of decentralization, which is more institutional than fiscal. So you have new duties attributed to local governments, but not enough transfer from the national government. So in terms of advocacy, that's one of the number one components. Local participation, it's something, well, it was described previously by my colleague, Professor Chazen, this importance to adapt it to the expectation of residents, which is a term used in city diplomacy rather than citizens, because cities are a place of both permanent and temporary living, and to include everyone, we say residents. Political priority of the mayor, unless the mayor doesn't believe in these international actions, it won't really happen. And finally, the human resources. You need skilled city diplomats to do that. And there is an important role of universities for that. Well, once you have all of that, what do you gain? Basically, these three major resources that cities are fighting for. And we talk about technical resources quite frequently. It's this capacity to act internationally. And this is something that happens usually thematically on specific fields of action of municipalities. And I saw in our audience, Ms. Simina Lazar, who was a coordinator of the African Smart Towns Network, or ASTON, an amazing project of 11 cities all over the continent, that decided to collaborate with a participatory, multi-level collaboration methodology in order to advance each in their specific digital transition goals. A very impactful project. You have, of course, financial reasons to act internationally, receiving funding from external donors. An example is the Global Cities Fund for migrants and refugees, set up by big charities and operated by two city networks, the Mixed Migration Center and C40. And of course, this voice of local Africa I was mentioning, which is the political resources coming together to have one strong opinion and present it to the other stakeholders on the international scene. We have two big events, Cup of Cities and AfriCité. We have to say city diplomacy is going in an evolutionary direction. It started in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was highly characterized by the process of decolonization, where basically it worked in terms of solidarity, in bringing together cities from former enemies or former colonized countries. So it was a way to express the wish of connection of the people, a wish that a lot of mayors have been able to interpret. But then a number of other dimensions were added to this, the dimension of economic development, vital since the 90s with the process of globalization. Then in the 50s, the ideas of the possibility of bringing together solidarity and values with economic development and interest, all of that in partnerships. This is the sort of overall vision of the Sustainable Development Goals, and symbolized specifically by SDG 17. You have multi-level governance. This is idea of collaboration between the different levels of government to achieve joint targets, but especially address those joint challenges. Climate change, migration, inequalities require this collaboration, and that's what city diplomacy is trying to present to the world. And finally, this concept of the seat of the global table, having municipalities express their vision of the future in the fora that are set to define the future of humanity. And I'm actually speaking from one of those fora, the UNECE Forum of Mayors, happening now at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, and I have just listened to the testimony of the mayors of Cotonou, Damietta, Dire Dawa, Dodoma, Kigali, and many other African mayors that are presenting their vision. Well, that doesn't go without a number of challenges. I will go fast on that. I don't want to take too much time from the Q&A. There is a number of goals and challenges that are assembling all the cities in Africa. Climate change, this is something that has been issued and presented by mayors in Africa themselves. Climate change with the impact, a strong component on impact, not only on communities, but on infrastructure. The idea of regionalism, South-South cooperation, the just transition with a strong accent on energy, and the idea of human capital with knowledge to manage this potential of collaboration. Of course, that comes with a challenge. Those cities who do city diplomacy are mainly big cities, and there is an issue of territorial equity for that, how to empower the smaller cities for that, how to avoid duplication and overlap, which is connected to the activity of those big cities. They concentrate much of these international activities. The problem that Africa is divided in language areas, and there is little city diplomacy between those areas. And finally, proxy foreign policy with external actors that try to have a hand over the diplomacy of their own cities. Those non-democratic external actors might want to influence local governments in Africa. That's a big challenge. I will conclude with just two examples of the voice of mayors. The two biggest one, most recent, AfriCité, a Congress happened, which took place in Kisumu, intermediary city in Kenya, last May. And the goal here was to highlight the importance of intermediary and small cities and empower them, as was said, in order to fight this territorial divide. And there was a strong component, as you can see, of accent on the need for cities to receive the tools to act internationally and address those challenges. And finally, the COP of cities, which is a specific answer to the COP, the three COPs, Conference of Parties of the Rio Conventions of the United Nations that gather nation states. The parties are only nation states. So cities, they said, we want to express our voice, and they organized last July in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, this gathering. And here it was about addressing the attention of the world on the role of cities and also asking for support to do that. To conclude, this is an expanding activity. You can see cities, growing number of cities in Africa being part of it. It's a huge success for those who are actually doing it, as it is evidenced by the impact of those global and regional partnership established by African cities. To go further, we will need decentralization, knowledge exchange, capacity development to multiply the impact of that, spread it, and make sure that there is and support this emergence of the African local voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for that presentation. We are kind of running behind, but I'll invite our third panelist to speak to us. Welcome, Emanuela Giorgi, and give us your presentation.
I thank you very much, Muruji. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's a big pleasure and honor to be here to share with you some consideration and experience that we are working with in Mexico, in the north part of Mexico. And of course, I'm not an expert on African cities, but I would like to share with you this experience and consideration, trying to find some community patterns with the African cities. And according with the presentation of Prof. Chasin and Dr. Grandi, I think we can find several common points. First of all, let me introduce the context where we are working and because I strongly believe that these issues about vulnerable situation are extremely contextual. I mean, we cannot think about vulnerability without considering the context where we are working on. Actually, we are working in the state of Chihuahua, which is in the north part of Mexico on the border with the US. And the places where we are working on actually nowadays are these 5 communities that I will show you during the presentation. And as you can see here in this map with the satellite view, the state of Chihuahua, which actually is the biggest state in Mexico, has different environments. One is the desert, that is the desert of Chihuahua, connecting from Durango to Texas, basically. Then a semi-arid area, which is very important for the agricultural production in Mexico. And then there is another forestal area that is basically where we have the community of Basasiachi, which is the Sierra or the forestal area where we are working with. Actually, we started this project on design for vulnerables, so design with vulnerables, 3 years ago with the research question related with how design, architectural, urban design, or design of services have to change, to evolve in the next decades, and in particular with the context of vulnerable communities. So I would like to underline some characteristics of Mexican cities that I think are very related with African cities. First of all, one important issue is related with international or internal migration. International or internal migration is very important here in the state of Chihuahua, of course, because there are some international movement from the south of America coming to the border, and so crossing the state of Chihuahua. And this is in international migration that cross from the city of Chihuahua, and another is an international migration that stop in the state in Ciudad Juarez, and basically it means that migrants here spend more time rather than in the city of Chihuahua. There is also an internal migration within the state and within Mexico from rural area to cities, and cities just in the last 10 days growth of 15% basically. And there is another internal migration from some not productive rural areas to productive rural areas, and this is a seasonal migration, which is a very important phenomenon here in the state of Chihuahua. There is another issue that is related with the urban sprawl and poor urban development policies. City centers in Mexican cities are not disappearing, but are losing a lot of importance. On the contrary, peripheral areas are increasing in the relevance within the urban territories, and this all often brings to some social reduction of quality of life. And then there is another important issue that is related with the informal settlements. The 25% of urban population in Mexico live in informal settlement, and a phenomenon that is often related with informal settlement is related with the self-production of houses. And in Mexico, almost 60% of Mexicans live in houses that are self-built or self-produced. So these are three important issues. I want to underline also that the quality of houses is improving and improving in the last 70 years. For example, the average number of occupants per room decreased a lot from 3 to 1, basically, and the quality of the materials for the walls, roof, and floor also increased a lot, from 10%, for example, of dwellings that were made with walls with durable materials, nowadays almost 100%, so 90%, so increase a lot the quality. This kind of data are not enough to express the quality of housing, of course, because the quality of housing is also, and of course, 100% related with the context and with the urban territories, I mean, accessibility and so on. And to show this, I would like to show the case of Ciudad Juarez, as I told you, on the border with United States, with El Paso, which is unfortunate. It was at least it was considered the most violent city in the world for several years, mainly due for the cartels war. In Ciudad Juarez, there are some aspects. First of all, the wall is one very important infrastructure that is always present in the landscape of the city. The city center, as I told you, is almost a ghost city. People and housing are moving in the peripheries, and this is the kind of periphery, which is kind of archipelago made by islands, island for housing, island for production, island for agriculture. And the connection between the islands is almost known, because these empty spaces are often associated with violent place, or places with lack of quality, lack of transportation. And this is one of the community that we were working with last year. And there is this case of this woman, which is basically the doctor of the community, coming from the south of Mexico. And she said that she couldn't attend any meeting with the doctor in the hospital, basically because of the lack of accessibility to the hospital. There's very important issues in Ciudad Juarez, this archipelago, and the violence context of the archipelago. And basically, this is the real context of this archipelago I was showing you. So this is a picture taken more or less like here. So this physical presence of violence, of pollution, contamination is always present in the image of the city. These are just some pictures of the periphery. And there is another issue, of course, related with the lack of services. In this case, agua por favor means water, please. And these words outside of the houses in the southwest of Ciudad Juarez, because there is no infrastructure, and so municipality has to bring every day water to the houses. This is very difficult contest, of course, and which require a lot of consideration, a lot of efforts from designers, architects, and urban designers to improve this situation. I want to share with you some publication that we made about these issues, and with this experience design for vulnerable communities, and the principle of design for vulnerable communities, which basically collect the experience that we made in this context. Then last year we started a project related with design with vulnerable communities, but with a particular focus that comes from a concern that we have, that is related with the role of technology in design for these kind of communities. In these diagrams, we can see very well as how when there is a technological development, the distance between the development of the core where this technological development happen and the periphery increase a lot. This means two things. First of all, we are worrying about the fact that if technology cannot reach the most vulnerable communities, this vulnerable community becomes more and more vulnerable. On the other side is that if technology cannot access vulnerable communities, technology cannot bring the benefits of technology itself to improve the quality in the vulnerable community. So we started this project, Design for Vulnerables Technology Challenge, which is supported and funded by the challenge-based research funding program with $200,000 US. And thanks to this project, we wanted to understand how can we, as designer, define some methodologies to introduce technological resources in vulnerable communities to reduce the vulnerabilities of these communities. And to do this, of course, we had to understand the meaning of vulnerabilities. And as this draws represent, if we want to understand something so complex as vulnerability, we need to have different visions. So we invite all the 6 schools, faculties of Tecnológico de Monterrey, the Instituto Mora, Tonji University, University of Pavia, and Columbia University with Dr. Samantha Winter, who is playing a key role within this research, trying to understand which are the vulnerabilities in these communities and try to understand how technological resources can improve this situation. Again, in this case, we are working just on these 4 communities, Paso del Norte, which is an urban context, Nuevas Delicias, which is a peri-urban context, La Regina, rural context, and Vasasiacic, the number 4, which is a forestal context. So semi-arid context, but everyone with its own peculiarities. I would like to share with you this context and then the project that we are implementing there, just to make a final consideration. Paso del Norte is an urban one, as you can see here, a highway, the yellow line, and a river, the blue line, separate Paso del Norte from the city of Chihuahua, basically, and people in this community perceive this kind of isolation and lack in accessibility. And you can see here the only access, pedestrian access to the communities is pedestrian bridge, which looks like a cage, no, a prison, basically, creating problems of perception of security. And then the river that at the beginning was something that the community was proud of, now is a polluted and contaminated element, physical elements that separate community from the city. And again, in the community itself, there is these big issues with environmental problem. The canyons are filled with garbage, just trying to win and to gain more and more land for construction. So basically, these houses are built over garbage. So very important environmental issues and problems here in this community. The other community, peri-urban communities with an agricultural focus, but they are living in these communities important problems related with water scarcity. The level of underground water went from -4 meters to -80 meters in the last 20 years. So a bad agricultural system that basically is focused on nuts, and nuts need 200 liters per day for each tree, is a totally coherent agricultural system within the community. This is the landscape, and this is where livestock basically are grown. And again, issues with the water, to give water to the livestock here in this community. Another community in the south, which is rural communities, is in this area, which is far away from the main highway that cross the state, agricultural system consuming a lot of water, but this water has a big problem that is basically is contaminated with heavy metals. in particular arsenic and fluor. And so this create social problems and environmental problems, but healthy problems, first of all. Then there are also some problems related with extreme poverty in this community, and of course, drugs and prostitution and crime related with this extreme poverty. This kind of system, which is basically inverse osmosis, that municipalities and some philanthropic companies try to implement here to reduce the heavy metals in the water, nowadays are basically not more used, because they pollute more than what they can solve as problem. So this solution is not more available anymore. And at the same time, there are very interesting and positive elements here in this community, which are related with this very beautiful natural environment, which can be and somehow is people in the community take advantage for touristic purpose. And the last community I want to show is Vasasiacic. Here we can see the town of Vasasiacic. Vasasiacic is characterized by a very beautiful natural environment with one of the highest not seasonal waterfall, one of the tallest in America. But there is a big trait related with Vasasiacic, that are the mines of gold and silver, who are contaminate the environment, but also are creating some social concern related with the fact that when the mines are closing, problems with work and jobs will start to appear in Vasasiacic. So a very beautiful environment on one side that somehow is, again, people from the community take advantage with some very small touristic purpose. And on the other side, these big mines that are destroying the landscape, destroying the natural resources, and of course creating problems with the society. So from January 2023 to June 2023, we made 40 workshops with the communities, trying to define some projects based on technology that could improve the quality of life in these communities. Nowadays, we are in the period of we are implementing this intervention, and then starting from October to June 2024 or December 2024, we will make measurements to evaluate the impact of this community, of these technological resources in this vulnerable community. Let me show you which are the results of this discussion with the communities and the project that we are implementing. First of all, trying to reduce the problem of lack of accessibility to Passo del Norte, we try to implement a network of electric bikes with the goals that the community can learn how to make an electric bike from a traditional bike, so to implement also some entrepreneurship activities within the communities. And in this case, we are just bringing some electric bikes to the communities with the goal to facilitate the access to the communities. Here we can see a little bit the slope to reach the community, but actually later the slope is higher and higher. So in particular, women and older women have some difficulties to access the community with coming from the grocery stores and so on. In Passo del Norte, as you saw, there are also some issues related with the environmental environment and pollution. And in Passo del Norte, we are working with an association, a civil organization that is Accionetica. And the activity of Accionetica is that every Saturday in the morning, they organize some classes for the kids, for the children of the community. So we are implementing in this public space, let's say a technological gazebo, where we are implementing free Wi-Fi, a cinema, some tools for education, that means tablets or Oculus, so to have access to other ways, other methods of education and free education here in the community. So now we are just in the moment to create the gazebo and create this some hardware for the Wi-Fi. But we hope to complete everything on the end of October. Complete everything means also to have a solar system that can give energy to this complex. Then, when we spoke about Nuevas Delicias, the agricultural hub, where we had this big problem of bad consumption of water, we arrived to the project to create a hub which is focused on the development of ideas for a sustainable agriculture and livestock. We are working with primary, secondary, and high schools, a club of elder people, and the union of farmers, and we are seeing some opportunity to work with technological greenhouses, drones, to map the livestock and to see the quality and the management, to check the management of the wells, and with another agricultural topic, which is related with cactus. And basically we are supporting this project in the secondary school, try to create a domestic production of cactus for consumption of the livestock. So trying to reduce the water used for the alfalfa, which is basically the meal for the food for livestock, and moving to the cactus food, because it doesn't consume any water, and there are some research saying that cactus is fine for cows. So we are trying to implement this kind of project, and these, as the other project, are projects that are focused on trying to create consciousness about this risk, about these vulnerabilities, and create some opportunities. When we were speaking about the community with problem on heavy materials in water, well, we developed this project based on a technology which has been so this is a filter just for heavy materials. And then in Vaza Siacic, again, some project with, again, trying to improve environmental consciousness within schools. And another project related with tourism, so trying to bring capacity to create some digital image of Vaza Siacic and the natural characteristic and opportunities for tourism in this forestal area. So just to summarize some points that I think was very important, such environmental vulnerabilities are design problems, of course, and technology can be a threat and a salvation. We would like to see the opportunity to bring technological resources in the communities, trying to reduce vulnerabilities, and technological resources should be considered as a tool, not as trying to reduce these vulnerabilities. And very important issues, creating empathy with the communities, which is a long path, but part of the solution itself. So this is what we wanted to share with you, hoping that these similarities can be brought to African cities too. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much. We had some amazing presentations. And now I'd like to introduce two collaboratory students who will be asking live questions today. So first, let's welcome to the collaboratory, Eunice Lambumba. Eunice is from Nairobi, Kenya, and she is a fourth-year student at Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, studying a course in public management and development studies. Eunice has a passion for understanding the socioeconomic factors influencing global development, analyzing policy frameworks, and exploring innovative solutions to address inequalities. These interests and passions led her to join this semester's collaboratory, where she'll be happy, she is able to apply her knowledge on development studies gained from school. Thank you, Eunice, and welcome. Please ask your questions.
Hello.
Hello.
So first of all, I'd like to say I'm very honored to be part of the conversation. And my question is, what strategies can be put in place to encourage meaningful citizen participation in the urban planning process, so that we ensure that the needs and the voices of diverse communities are taken into account when we are reimagining the urban city spaces and the infrastructure. Thank you.
Do any of our panelists want to tackle that question?
I'm happy to make an initial stab. Thanks, Eunice, that's a really fantastic question. Also, I suspect, as most people think, a pretty overwhelming one, and it really gets to the heart of the issue with regard to how to create the most flexible, most equitable, collaborative entities in cities. And I personally, my feeling is, and this is based on conversations that I've had and just the research that I've done, that ultimately it comes down to the production and acquisition of knowledge. That when you have access to information, it allows you to be more informed, more involved, more engaged, and to understand what your stake is in the larger scheme of things. And in order to achieve, and I mentioned it briefly in my presentation, but the increase in accessibility to education, I mean, it's not an easy, clear path, but it's one that is definitely enhanced by increased urbanization. And I would hope that larger governmental stakeholders would recognize the necessity of transparency, of making information available. And I think, what Dr. Grandi was talking about in terms of diplomacy also is very much something that extends into this kind of transparency that attempts to and attends to the inequities and asymmetries around access to information, to knowledge, information that produces knowledge, and therefore empowers people to speak on their own behalves. And doing that is something that then opens onto the possibility of greater collaborations and stronger collective voices that I think can really be exceedingly powerful.
Thank you so much. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead, Lorenzo.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Shannon. I was thinking to just share what has currently being done to make sure that it is possible to make participatory international action to address those urban challenges that are shared. So there is a ongoing trend of developing those physical places for meeting that are classified in different ways in different places. Some people call them living labs, some people call them third places. In French, they are known as tiers-lieux. It's a sort of a new way of understanding the participatory decision-making with the openness to ideas from members of the community, but also a sort of guiding approach of municipalities, the contribution of experts, the contribution of universities, the private sector. So it's really a coming together, multi-stakeholder approach to try and analyze the specificities of the challenge with the specificities of the talents on the ground.
Thank you. Manuela?
Thank you, Shannon. Just to point of view related with maybe the main problems related with the participatory processes, that they take time. So sometimes the timing is not the political timing, and so there is not the will from political side to maybe to implement, at least in the local level, no? Or sometimes not the willing to listen something that you don't want to listen. So it is a very important issue. And here, academia, I think, is have to play a very important role as a bridge between community and at least civil organization. And of course, the goal is what Noah was saying. So creating consciousness in the community, and creating consciousness, people will know that they need participatory process and will push on that side.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Eunice, for your question. Now I want to welcome Kiara Lu Parillo. Kiara Lu is a human rights major in the dual Bachelor's of Arts degree program between Sciences Po and Columbia. She has immersed herself in the topics of humanitarian interventionism, international law, and transitional justice. She's passionate about the ways society marked by legacies of large-scale human rights abuses deal with their complex past, while working towards a sustainably peaceful and democratic future. Kiara Lu is also an experienced international touch rugby player and recently represented the state of New York at the American Nationals tournament last September. Welcome, Kiara Lu.
Hello, thank you for this introduction, and thank you all panelists for your very interesting presentations. My question is also touching on this very interesting and necessary process of this participatory urban planning and urbanization, but I'd like to touch more upon how do you address the needs of a particular local and urban community, and what does this relationship between and this dialogue between experts and locals come about? Thank you.
Oh, so just maybe, Chiara, thank you very much for the question. Maybe just trying to explain a little bit the experience here in Mexico, which is, I think, can be somehow common with other contexts. But of course, when we arrive to a community, we cannot arrive from zero, from scratch. We have to find some allies to create some relation with. So schools, associations, or civil organizations are very important in this process to create empathy with the community. Creating empathy is, again, a long process. You have to find a way to be able to make people in the condition to express themselves as if we are friends. So this is not a joke, but meal together with the community becomes very important part of the methodology, no, of the participatory design. And then there is another very important issue that we find sometimes difficult to do, is not to be aggressive or with the community. Speaking about vulnerability sometimes can be difficult, in particular if a white male arrive in the community, maybe sometimes is not very welcome sometimes, no? So creating this environment of empathy, I think, is the most important issue. They're not trying to be aggressive with the communities and be on site. I mean, work with people from the community, around the community, and so on, is in our condition, in our experience, has been the most effective way to understand deeply which are the opportunities to work there. So to implement technology. Also, if people maybe they don't know which is the technological resources that they want in this kind of context, they can express themselves in the best way. Thank you, Chiara.
Well, I totally agree with Emanuele, and I believe that from the perspective of academia, it's quite important to be able to establish this trust and true direction dialogue with the different communities that experience challenges. And I really feel inspired by the fact that Columbia University, Tecnológico de Monterrey, and so many other universities are fully embracing this, which is a vocation for me. We call it at Columbia the engagement pillar, and it's truly being at the service of addressing the major challenges together, each of us with their specific assets, tools, and being able to speak the same language, which is certainly a language of empathy, as has been said by Emanuele, and a language which is clear and sets a foundation for future action.
Thank you to the panelists who answered, and thanks so much, Kiara Lu, for asking your questions. I'm going to hand it over to Murugi to moderate the rest of our questions.
Yes, I think we have only about 2 minutes, but there's a question, I think, especially because this is a seminar, and students want to know where they can obtain more information. So there's a question from Yam from Columbia University, who asks, or he or she asks, are there any specific case studies or research findings that you would recommend for further reading in the context of urban development in Africa? How have certain policies and initiatives overcome pre-existing barriers such as infrastructure deficits and historical inequalities? So I think maybe Noah and Lorenzo, you could give some case studies, examples, or further study that the students can look at.
That's a great and somewhat overwhelming question as well. I would start by asking whether this student, I guess, is interested in more historical research or more contemporary ones, and that would have to do with also disciplinarily whether they're interested in looking at it from more of a sociological perspective, from more of a political studies perspective. Not to dodge the question, I mean, I could certainly accumulate a lot of case studies, but these questions are dealt with, I think, very differently and discreetly by different disciplines, and as a result of that, it's sort of it's important, at least in my opinion, to read broadly across different disciplines to understand, for example, what a sociological perspective versus an urban design perspective versus an anthropological one versus a political studies one would be. But I'm happy to after the seminar send some with a little bit more guidance in terms of what they're looking for, to send some recommendations.
And from my side, I could maybe suggest having a look at the publication issued by the South African Cities Network. They do not only work on South African cities, but also, generally speaking, very frequently they take into consideration a comparative approach of regional scope. So they've been able to collect the voices of practitioners and experts. They have published 2 amazing reports on city diplomacy. So that's definitely a suggestion I would give.
Thank you very much, Noah and Lorenzo. I think we are out of time, and I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists today for your presentations. And let me also thank all the students who have been with us and are still with us. And there are a lot of other questions that were asked that we did not get to, but we'll see what we can do about that. But let me just thank everybody who has participated today. We've learned a lot, and we hope that you'll join us for the next one, our next seminar on this topic of healthy cities in Africa. So let me hand it off to Shannon to close us out.
Thank you. Well, we've had an engaging discussion on reimagining African cities with a focus on design, participation, and diplomacy. Our conversation touched on many critical issues, including sociological perspectives, design perspectives, anthropological perspectives, and comparative approaches. We've even discussed where to find more information, case studies, and research findings for our students. This was the second seminar in our series, as was mentioned, on this theme as part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform that brings Columbia students thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We are looking forward to the next seminar. As was mentioned, it'll be offered on Monday, October 16th. I believe the focus is on bringing clean, safe, affordable cooking energy to households across African cities, and certainly the health implications of that. Thanks again to our esteemed panelists who joined us today, to our amazing moderator, Marugi. Many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Centers Nairobi, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to all of our collaboratory students, partners, and participants from around the world. A reminder that a link to a recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. And for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.